Greetings and welcome to this module number 5 in our course on human rights, law, and government. We've been looking at topics such as the rule of law, international law, theories of law. We've looked at constitutions, some comparative constitutions, looking at the United States Constitution, and several of you have compared it with your national constitutions, which I thought was a very good exercise. We looked at some of the background context for the Declaration of Independence, given that this was the 250th anniversary of that document, which was developed by Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin, a couple of others, back in the spring and summer of 1776. So today we are moving into a discussion of the United Nations, which brings together issues such as rule of law, which we've talked about as it relates to the three primary areas or pillars of the United Nations: peace and security, human rights, number 2, and 3, development or sustainable development, as we more often say now, as it relates to the sustainable development goals of the United Nations. The United Nations also has been a central pillar of the human rights movement. When the Charter of the UN was developed in the spring of 1945, in the final stages of World War II, it was already anticipated that a universal declaration of human rights would be crafted, and indeed it was decided at the recommendation of President Harry Truman, who succeeded Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that Eleanor Roosevelt, the spouse of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was kind of the not the brainchild, the political will representative who drove forward, together with Winston Churchill, the United Nations as an institution to bring an end to war for succeeding generations, centering on these pillars: peace and security, human rights, and development, sustainable development. So the United Nations is about a certain form of international governance. It is not an international government. It doesn't have the sovereignty or the executive authority to function as a world government, but it is in many respects an instrument of global governance, in that it presides over many areas with an international scope in the area of trying to do peacekeeping efforts, to resolve conflict, to promote diplomacy, to troubleshoot problem areas, to be at the forefront of development, and particularly through the sustainable development goals, to have a very global vision and to try to coordinate activities all across the globe, including areas such as law, human rights, and government. So the United Nations, while not itself a government, its members are governments or representatives of governments. They are the nation states. The 193 member states are all sovereign states, as we call them, dating back to the time of the Peace of Westphalia. So I'm going to walk us through a number of the key issues. You've got quite a few readings, and this instructor's recorded video and other items to study for this week's assignment. We do offer a course in the United Nations and civil society, and I hope if you haven't already taken that, I hope you'll have the opportunity to take that in the future. It is offered this fall, and instructor John Kester, who's a graduate of the Peace Studies program and currently a doctoral candidate at the University for Peace based in Costa Rica. But without further ado, I'll go to my slideshow, share my screen here so that we can go through and hopefully we'll all benefit from the content that's presented here as we look at the United Nations and its relevance to our topic for this course, human rights law and government. In the 19th and early 20th century, there is a kind of way of looking at history, particularly in the West, of kind of building up toward the United Nations with various world organizations. Now, we did talk about the Peace of Westphalia from 1648, but then a next major event in this journey and story of the development of sovereign nation states was the Congress of Vienna, sometimes called the Concert of Vienna or the Vienna Compact. I usually say Congress of Vienna, which took place in Vienna, Austria, 1814 to 15, and involved nations such as Russia and England and France and what we today call Germany and Austria, which were really the major powers of the Western Hemisphere. And they came up with a certain platform to collaborate, cooperate, and seek to resolve disputes diplomatically. They were coming in the aftermath of what sometimes called the Napoleonic Wars. There had been a revolution in France, the French Revolution in 1789, and then Napoleon reclaimed power in France and sought to expand throughout Europe until the Battle of Waterloo. But the Concert of Vienna sought to prevent such activity in the future, and it was effective in that respect. Also, some 80 years later, there were a growing sense of the need for peace conferences, and The Hague in the Netherlands, which is kind of an international center, a peace center where the International Court of Justice is located. And there were two peace conferences, one in 1899 and one in 1907, that were kind of landmark international gatherings to discuss topics of peace, attempts to control the resort to war to solve conflicts, to try to solve conflicts through diplomacy. Now, the Hague Peace Conferences did not succeed in preventing World War I, which broke out in 1917. It is noted here, those of you with an interest in Korea, that Yi Jun had been sent by the Korean emperor to attend the peace conference in The Hague, the Netherlands. There he is on the left of a group of 3 Koreans. And they were there to ask at the peace conference for them to call the Japanese to move out of Korea, that the Japanese were in essence violating international law. So this consciousness was in the air, as was this consciousness for national independence. And the Koreans felt very frustrated that they had been occupied by the Japanese. The next major step followed the disaster of World War I. And that was an effort to create the League of Nations when the victorious powers met in Paris and Versailles in 1919 to map out the plan for Reconstruction and in a way, the punishment of Germany for its role in the war, and to try to secure an institutional framework that would keep the peace going forward. That was called the League of Nations, the forerunner or immediate predecessor of the United Nations. And the League was kind of envisioned by another American president. That was Woodrow Wilson. He wrote a speech that he prepared in going to Paris at the end of World War I. And in the 14th point of the 14 points in his speech, he called for the establishment of a general association of nations under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small nations or states alike. So this association of nations later became called the League of Nations and later still the United Nations. So this was aimed at restricting the use of force as a means of resolving conflict between nations. It called for the establishment of a permanent court of justice where disputes between states could be settled by a judiciary. But the League was impotent, ineffective in preventing massive destructive events of the 20th century. Once again, Korea sent Kim Kyu-sik to attend the Paris Peace Conference in 2019, where the League of Nations was born, gave birth, even though the United States never became a member, because although the president Woodrow Wilson was in many ways the architect of it, his own Senate, his own legislature. Here's where you could look at separation of powers between a judiciary, a legislature, and an executive. You had the executive, Woodrow Wilson, full force to advocate for the League of Nations and the United States to join it in 1920. But the check and balance system of the Senate did not ratify it. So the president was disempowered from being able to carry that forward without the support of the Senate. So here's a listing of nations that joined the League, and you'll see here some were founding members who stayed until the end. And some of these in the darker black color, and others were founding members who left, but then joined again later. The green are founding members that simply left and withdrew, like Japan, which was instrumental in starting World War II, left the League of Nations after initially being joined. The blue joined later and stayed until the end. Yellow joined later and left later, such as Germany, which also was central. So nations simply withdrew from the League when they were not willing to comply with its directives. So the League of Nations lacked teeth, lacked enforcement power. Some nations were under the League of Nations mandate, which were a kind of trustee state that was a kind of an emerging state. The gray never members. The light blue is kind of colonies of members. So much of Africa was colonized, and parts of Asia and Southeast Asia. So you see the complexity of the League in getting full buy-in by the member states throughout the world, leading to the failure and ineffectiveness and inability of the League to prevent conflict. It had no power to prevent conflict and essentially could not prevent World War II from developing, couldn't prevent the rise of National Socialism or the Nazi Party under Adolf Hitler in Germany, or the rise of Imperial Japan in Asia. So, nevertheless, the League developed its own charter called a covenant. It starts with a preamble. It talks about who can be a member and how you can withdraw in Article 1. So very much like a constitution. Articles 2 through 4 set up the kind of structure, almost the check and balance. You have an assembly, just like the General Assembly of the current United Nations. The League also had an assembly of its members, and it had something like the Security Council. And you can see those names were carried over. Even the assembly became the General Assembly, and the council became the Security Council to better clarify their roles. Article 5 talked about how decisions would be made, and unanimity was required in decisions as distinct from, say, a majority approval. It spoke about aggression and war, and that it should not be resorted to except in self-defense. It created a permanent court of international justice in The Hague. It talked about sanctions, meaning things like economic sanctions, where you cut off the supply of resources or loans or aid, economic aid to different countries. It stipulated there should be no secret or private treaties. Treaties should be transparent. And it talked about mandates, that is, how to deal with countries that either in the wake of World War I or simply because they had not developed the instruments of a nation state, such as a functioning rule of law, a parliamentary or congressional system, no judiciary that was independent, and no executive that was willing to be limited in their powers. So certain nations were kind of under the supervision of the League during this time. This is also the era when communism in the Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, was established, centering on Russia. The Bolshevik Revolution took place in October of 1917, led by Vladimir Lenin. Lenin creates the Soviet state in the wake of World War I. From 1922 to 24, Lenin established that state. He was succeeded by Joseph Stalin, who perfected totalitarian rule of public and private aspects of life. He led for some 25 years approximately, 15 years from 1929 to 53. Communism was in many respects a disaster, and its effort to create its utopia came over the dead bodies of millions of people, unfortunately. And here a list of the human cost. 65 million died in the Maoist revolution in China, 20 million in the Bolshevik Revolution and thereafter in securing the totalitarian state, 2 million in Cambodia, 2 million in North Korea, nearly 2 million in Ethiopia, and 1.5 million in Afghanistan in the war there with the Soviet Union. Throughout Eastern Europe, 1 million, Vietnam, 1 million, 150,000 in Latin America. So the list goes on of the deep and dark, tragic experience of communism in the world. Going back to the Second World War, Hitler consolidated power in Germany in the 1930s. In 1939, Hitler and Stalin collaborated to make a plan for conquering Europe and kind of gobbling up Europe. And Hitler also formed an alliance with both Italy and Japan, two other more totalitarian, aggressive, expansionist, militant countries at that time. And the world is plunged into warfare between the totalitarian world of the Soviet Union and the National Socialists and the Japanese and the fascism of Mussolini in Italy. So a desperate time. Here is Joseph Stalin and Hitler toasting to their alliance that was represented by the Molotov-Ribbentrop agreement that they signed together. Here is Molotov from representing Russia and Ribbentrop representing Germany and their signed agreement from 1939, something that they denied until finally the evidence was irrefutable. What happened here? Okay. So this was a dark day, and perhaps the darkest day in the history of Europe. During this World War II, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is the dominant figure from the Western Alliance, and he gave a speech in January 1941 called the Four Freedom Speech, where he talks about freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom of fear, freedom from fear, and freedom from want. Saying the democratic way of life is at this moment being directly assailed in every part of the world. That's what he means, this rise of communism, of fascism, Nazism, Imperial Japan, and the democratic way of life is at this moment being directly assailed in every part of the world. The assailants are on the march, threatening nations great and small. The armed defense of democratic existence is now being gallantly waged on 4 continents. If that defense fails, all the population and all the resources of Europe, Asia, Africa, and Australasia will be dominated by the conquerors. So this is a life and death world war that is underway. In continuing his State of the Union message from January 6th, certainly this is no time for any of us to stop thinking about the social and economic problems which are the root cause of the social revolution, which is today a supreme factor in the world. In the future days, which we seek to make secure, we look forward to a world founded upon 4 essential human freedoms. And again, that is no vision of a distant millennium. It is a definite basis for a kind of world attainable in our time and generation. And he goes on to say, this same speech, this nation, the United States, has placed its destiny in the hands and heads and hearts of its millions of free men and women, and its faith in freedom under the guidance of God. Freedom means the supremacy of human rights everywhere. Our support goes to those who struggle to gain those rights or keep them. Our strength is our unity of purpose, to that high concept there can be no end save victory. So this was the will and spirit of Franklin Roosevelt, and that kind of spirit was needed to overcome the threats coming from communism, filled with a great utopian vision that it would create the socialist paradise, or the Nazi socialists of Adolf Hitler, or Imperial Japan, or fascist Italy. So in August of 1941, Franklin Delano Roosevelt secretly meets with Winston Churchill out on the high seas off the coast of Newfoundland. They met secretly because their whereabouts had to be secure so that it would not be known by the Germans who were bombing ships in the Atlantic. So they called for self-government and that all nations should have the choice of their form of government, equal access to trade and raw materials, economic collaboration, freedom from fear and want. These were some of the items they wanted to put in this Atlantic Charter. This is the first draft of the United Nations Charter that's mapped out here in August of 1941. The war is raging, but they are confident that the Allies will win, and on the foundation of victory, they will establish the United Nations. So many ask, well, why at some point, if Hitler and the Nazis and Stalin and the communists were forming an alliance to conquer Europe, why did the US and the USSR, the Soviets, become allies in World War II? Well, that was because Hitler betrayed Stalin and invaded Russia, invaded the Soviet Union. So when that happened, Roosevelt felt he had to form an alliance with the Soviet Union in order to defeat a greater threat. The Soviet Union was a threat, but the Nazis were seen as a greater threat. So Roosevelt believed correctly that Nazi Germany was the greatest threat at that time. And on June 22nd, 1941, when Hitler invaded the USSR, then the US feared that the Soviet Union would fall to the Nazis. So the US came to the aid at that time of the Soviet Union. In the Yalta Conference, 1945, Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin meet. Roosevelt is in very bad health. He probably should not have taken this journey to Yalta in the Crimea, was area of Ukraine. And this is where they further solidified the plan for the United Nations. It was Joseph Stalin that insisted he would not join unless he had the veto power to veto any bill that had come forward. So they agreed to that. That's where we get the veto power of the Permanent Five. The Permanent Five countries are the United States, Russia or the Soviet Union, England, France, and China. Then the victory in Europe took place on May 8th, 1945, and the Japanese surrender was in September of 1945 after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Here is the surrender. This is General Douglas MacArthur. And so as the World War II comes to an end or nears the end, because even before the end of the war, they're gathering already in San Francisco, which is where they will draft the charter, finalize the charter. They meet from April 25th of 1945 till latter part of June of 1945, and they create the Charter of the United Nations and attempt to move beyond the idea of the supreme sovereignty of the state and realize the vision of a international organization that would be able to prevent war in the future. So it was San Francisco that hosted the United Nations Conference on International Organizations, as it was called. 50 countries were represented there, including what we call the P5, the Permanent Five representatives, meaning they are the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, and they alone have the veto power in the Security Council. That's the United States, France, the United Kingdom, Soviet Union, and China. The UN Charter, we looked earlier in this slideshow at the League of Nations Covenant. This is the UN Charter, which is still in effect to this day. This is the headquarters. This headquarters is on First Avenue in New York near 45th Street overlooking the East River. This is the headquarters in Geneva. These other two photos are from the UN headquarters in New York, where the Secretariat is based, the General Assembly, and the Security Council. So the parts of the United Nations have these primary organs, the General Assembly, which is like the Parliament, although it has less power than the Parliament of a sovereign state. There's the Security Council, which is similar to an executive branch, but it too is lacking in true power unless the P5 can really come together. But due to the Cold War, it was rare that the P5, given that on one hand, the P5 are two communist countries, Russia and China, and three others, that if either side vetoes, little forward progress can be made. So there's General Assembly, number one, Security Council, which has the most powerful. Then there's the Economic and Social Council, works with the UN's economic, cultural, health, and educational. It's more of a humanitarian base of the United Nations. There's what is called the Trusteeship Council. It dealt with post-colonial countries who had not yet established governments with separation of powers, etc. It didn't have the wherewithal at that time. They didn't have the capacity to create a functioning government. So they were called the trusteeships or the trustee countries. Created the International Court of Justice and, of course, the Secretariat, which is led by the Secretary General. And it carries out the administrative duties. Current Secretary General is Antonio Guterres from Portugal. Prior to him was Ban Ki-moon from Korea, and there was Kofi Annan from Ghana. And usually each year it shifts to a different region of the world. Not each year. The term of office of a Secretary General is 5 years and can have up to 2 terms. But usually it is not a member of any of the P5 nations. So it's not anyone from the US, the Soviets, the Chinese, the British, French, but usually from Africa, Latin America, or Asia, apart from China. This is The Hague, where we talked about the peace conferences. So the International Court of Justice is based there. The General Assembly, every member of the United Nations, currently 193, has a seat at the General Assembly. And they bring up international issues that they want the Security Council to deal with. The General Assembly makes resolutions, but they have no enforcement power. They are more like proposals that have perhaps moral authority, but not executive authority. That the General Assembly will hold elections for Security Council members and other leaders, but it does not have power over electing the permanent 5 members once again. So the General Assembly is lacking in strong executive power, and the United Nations in general. It has no military to execute or back up its resolutions. It can only try to rely on the militaries of the powerful states to act in accordance with the UN. But if they do not, for whatever political reasons they have, for example, in Ukraine, you have Russia one of the permanent five members of the Security Council attacking Ukraine, and the U.S. supporting Ukraine, and France and England supporting Ukraine. And they cannot come to an agreement. So there's no way to enforce a resolution that Russia should withdraw from Ukraine, having wrongly invaded the country. Here's a picture of the General Assembly from the United Nations, where the General Assembly, and in September, in a few weeks, all the various high officials of the member states will gather for the General Assembly meeting now in its 81st year. The Security Council has 15 members. 10 of them rotate every 2 years. The permanent five, again, plus 10 who only serve for 2 years. It is the strong arm in the UN. It's aimed at maintaining international peace. It recommends peaceful negotiations and peace talks. It can resort to economic sanctions and, to some extent, military sanctions, but usually in the cases of smaller and weaker nations, and only where the P5 are kind of in general agreement. This is a view of the UN Security Council at the UN headquarters in New York. And in terms of the Charter, Article 1 and the purpose of the UN, its primary purpose, number one, maintain international peace and security. That's it. That's of the three pillars I mentioned earlier. Peace and security is number one, followed by human rights, followed by sustainable development. Those are the three pillars. And toward that end, it takes effective collective measures for the prevention and removal of threats to peace and for the suppression of acts of aggression or other breaches of the peace. This is the Charter's indication of the purpose of the United Nations. Article 2.3, all members shall settle their international disputes by peaceful means in such a manner that international peace and security and justice are not endangered. That's a great ideal. Has it been practiced? I'm sorry to say, no, not always. Article 2, point number 4, all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity, the sovereignty, or political independence of any state or in any manner, inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. This is what's drafted in 1945. Article 51, nothing in the present charter shall impair the inherent right of individual and collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs against a member state of the UN, until the Security Council has taken measures necessary to maintain international peace. So the right of self-defense remains when an individual member state nation violates the UN Charter and unjustly attacks and violates the sovereignty of another member state. The Security Council, Article 39, has the right to determine the existence of any threat to peace. It can interpret and establish a breach of peace or act of aggression. It shall make recommendations or decide what measures shall be taken in accordance with Articles 41 and 42 to maintain or restore international peace and security. So this is the real number one pillar of the UN, peace and security. And the Security Council has that primary mandate. Articles 41 and 42 are very important. The Security Council may decide what measures not involving the use of armed force are to be employed to give effect to its decisions. So its first resort is not to armed force. It's looking for measures not involving the use of armed force that can be employed to give effect to its decisions. And it may call upon the members to apply such measures. These may include complete or partial interruption of economic relations, and of rail, sea, air, postal, telegraphic, radio, and other means of communication, and the severance of diplomatic relations. These are measures short of war that the Security Council can seek to bring to bear on nations that violate sovereignty. And in Article 42, should the Security Council consider that measures provided in Article 41, the article I just quoted, that they would be inadequate or have proved to be inadequate, it may take such action by air, sea, or land forces, meaning military, as may be necessary to maintain or restore international peace and security. Such action may include demonstrations, blockades, and other operations by air, sea, or land forces of members of the United. So it has this peacekeeping capacity, or it is authorized to do that. And Korea was the first great test of the United Nations when the North invaded what we call South Korea today in 1950. And after World War II, Korea was divided between the Republic of Korea in the South and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the name of the regime in the North. And the Korean War waged militarily from 1950 to 1953. Efforts at reconciliation and unification failed. In 1991, both states were admitted into the United Nations. This shows the South, the North invaded and virtually took over the entire South. And it was the United States leading a coalition of 16 nations that made an invasion at Incheon. They called the Incheon landing of General Douglas MacArthur, that cut off the North Koreans and expelled them from South Korea in a very bloody, horrific war. And the reason that the UN became involved is that the Soviet representative of the Security Council had withdrawn in early 1950 in protest at the UN's refusal to recognize Communist China as the representative of China in the UN. There was still this dispute between Communist China, People's Republic of China, and what was called or still is called in Taiwan, the Republic of China. And so North Korea attacked the South. Russia had withdrawn. It was kind of forfeiting its vote and its veto. This created the opening, kind of miraculously, that allowed the Security Council to permit the coalition to respond to the North Korean attack on South Korea. So this is just a slide that repeats the four freedoms of Franklin Roosevelt. The resolution called Security Council Resolution 82 from June 25th, 1950 calls for immediate cessation of hostilities and for North Korea to withdraw. Calls upon all member states to render every assistance to the United Nations to execute this resolution and refrain from giving assistance to North Korea. So this was the UN in action. One of the rare times, maybe the rarest of times, that it could enter a major conflict and bring some resolution. Security Council Resolution 83 recommends that the members of the United Nations furnish such assistance to the Republic of Korea as may be necessary to repel the armed attack and to restore international peace and security in the area. So this is a case of the effectiveness of the UN, the decisiveness. And again, this is because Russia had withdrawn and therefore forfeited its capacity to veto this resolution of the United Nations Security Council. So in article, Resolution 84 of the Security Council, it recommends that all members providing military forces and other assistance and make such forces and other assistance available to a unified command under the United States. So this Resolution 84 gave the United States authority to lead the coalition, and it recommended all members to provide support to the United States and its effort. And it requests the United States to designate the commander of such forces. And this is the list of those nations that participated together with the United States in the effort to expel North Korea from South Korea. There's some pictures from that devastating war. This is MacArthur, perhaps at the time of the Incheon landing. Incheon is a city on the western coast of South Korea. And this picture of North Koreans, I believe this may be Kim Il-sung, who became the leader of North Korea. So also in November of 1950, the Uniting for Peace resolution resolved that if the Security Council, because of lack of unanimity of the permanent members, fails to exercise its primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security in any case where there appears to be a threat to the peace, breach of the peace, or act of aggression, the General Assembly shall consider the matter immediately with a view to making appropriate recommendations to members for collective members. So there is a resolution from the latter part of 1950 and the early years of the UN that in some respects empowered the General Assembly to take action when the Security Council was itself unable to act due to disunity among the members. Then another resolution in 1951, number 498, finds that the People's Republic of China under Mao had engaged in aggression in Korea, calls for the People's Republic of China to withdraw, affirms the determination of the United Nations to continue its action in Korea to meet aggression, and calls upon all states and authorities to lend every assistance to the United Nations action in Korea. So just gives you an idea of how the UN works through these various decisions and resolutions of the Security Council or of the General Assembly. Here's a signing of an armistice in the DMZ, the 38th parallel, at the time of the cessation of conflict. There was never a peace treaty, but an armistice, a cessation of hostilities. And this is a picture of the person, my good friend, who taught this course for a number of years. This is his father, who served in Korea. That was Professor William Ley, who passed away about a year ago. And this is also a picture of Professor Ley when he was born in Japan in 1952. His father, this is not his mother, but this is someone who was taking care of him in Japan when Mr. and Mrs. Ley, who were Americans, were living there. He and Bill Ley's father was in the military. So the UN also developed, and this is during the tenure of Kofi Annan, who was Secretary General, that they developed the concept of broadening the idea of security, that human security in its broadest sense embraces far more than the absence of violent conflict and encompasses human rights, good governance, access to education and health care, and ensuring that each individual has opportunities and choices to fulfill his or her own potential. Freedom from want, going back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, freedom from fear, and the freedom of future generations to inherit a healthy natural environment. These are the interrelated building blocks of human and therefore national security. So it's a stretching and expanding of the concept of security. Very important, this concept of human security. And UN has been known in the 21st century with a focus on specific targeted goals. First, what we call the Millennium Development Goals, because they were formulated in the year 2000, the new millennium. And then they were redeveloped and became the focus in 2015 and renamed the Sustainable Development Goals. These are other important areas. We don't have time to go into them, but they are a very, very central part of the mission and work of United Nations. I'm just going to go briefly through some slides that talk about the Russia and Ukraine, or just as a kind of brief case study that we know that Ukraine had been under the Soviet Union, and even after the end of the Soviet Union, Russia continued to interfere in Ukrainian elections, domestic affairs, and required that they support pro-Russian candidates and parties. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukraine volunteered to give up its nuclear weapons, to return all nuclear weapons to Russia, and they joined thereafter the Non-Proliferation Treaty, an international agreement among nations not to proliferate nuclear weapons. So it became a non-nuclear state. And a trilateral statement in 1994, agreed to transfer all warheads to Russia in exchange for, this is important, Russia would agree to respect Ukraine's independence and sovereignty, refrain from threat or use of force, economic non-coercion, and assistance in case of aggression against Ukraine. All of these, of course, were violated by Vladimir Putin and Russia, from this agreement of 1994. So this is Crimea, 2014. Russia annexed Crimea, this island peninsula area just south of, but part of Ukraine. And the annexation took place dramatically and quickly, and with Russia overpowering, and even a declaration of independence was declared by Russia and formal annexation in 2014. A complete violation of international law, but many times in international affairs, we say might, meaning power. Might makes right. Might as in the word mighty, a mighty force. That might makes right. Of course, it doesn't, but many times throughout history, great powers have acted as though might makes right. So then there was the annexation of Crimea, and Russia began to instigate conflict in the Donbas parts of Ukraine that are close, that are on the border with Russia, and Russia began its military buildup, and it began to develop hybrid warfare, disinformation campaigns, cyber attacks, economic pressure, military provocation. There were different agreements taken in Minsk, Belarus in 2014 and 15 aimed at ending the conflict. However, Russia failed to uphold its commitment and continued its military buildup. And it was in 2022, 4 years ago, it's 4.5 years ago, that Russia invaded and occupied Ukraine. And Zelensky addressed the Security Council, and this has been several emergency meetings, but Russia has been unwilling to yield in any way. The General Assembly did pass a resolution in March 2022 to call for a cessation of hostilities and urging members to provide humanitarian assistance. You can see in this resolution no real power, and Russia can look at that and kind of smirk or laugh that the UN has no power to intervene in any way that would threaten Russia. There is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that is most European countries and the United States and Canada, 32 countries. It was formed after World War II in 1949, and it's been a deterrence against Russian or Soviet aggression, but has been unable to prevent this invasion of Ukraine, but does remain a threat even to Russia. So I'm going to conclude this presentation now and hope you enjoy the various readings that have been made available on the module, and wish you success in your writing assignment. Always reach out to me if you have any questions. We're now in module number 5. We're over the halfway course. Will have completed 5 of the 8 modules. And keep in mind, prepare for your final term paper. What topic do you want to focus on? And please share that with me so I can give you some feedback on that point. Always free to email me. I will be announcing another time for a meeting of those of our class. We did have a nice discussion the other day, and we will have a meeting on the 30th of July at 8 a.m. New York time, 30th of July, 8 a.m. New York time. It's in the announcement, in the Zoom link is there. I think you'll benefit from it, particularly it was very helpful. Some had questions that are a benefit to everybody. It doesn't go long, and it also is an opportunity for you to share some of your thoughts about your final term paper. So I encourage you to attend. Never hesitate to reach out to me. Join this class. You're very bright and producing very good assignments that I enjoy reading. Okay, have a great week.